The serial killer cop, Mikhail Popkov. June 2012, among the passengers boarding a train from Vladivostok to Moscow, there was a man who looked completely ordinary. He wore a dark coat, plain trousers, and an old pair of sneakers. Nothing about his physical appearance was remarkable, but if you looked closely at his face, you could sense something unsettling. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov was 48 years old, a retired police officer who had left the force 10 years earlier. In his community, he was known as a respected family man, a hard worker, and a trusted friend. But this train journey from Vladivostok to Moscow would be anything but ordinary for him. Minutes before the train was scheduled to stop, 2 police officers entered his compartment. They watched Popkov for a brief moment. He noticed them, but showed no reaction. One of the officers pulled out a pair of handcuffs from his pocket. "Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, you are under arrest." The man slowly raised his head. He looked up from the book in front of him. There wasn't the slightest hint of surprise on his face. He stood up, slightly bowed his head, and extended his wrists for the handcuffs. He offered no resistance. As one officer tightened the handcuffs, the other spoke into his radio. "Target is in custody." Popkov made no protest. He walked slowly between the officers toward the train's exit. From that moment on, the process of solving one of Russia's bloodiest serial murder cases of recent years had begun. The arrest and initial revelations: a police car was waiting in front of Vladivostok train station. As Popkov was escorted into the vehicle, he said nothing. At that moment, no one yet knew exactly what this man was being charged with, but within a few weeks, the truth would begin to emerge. Russian police initially linked Popkov to 22 female murders committed in and around Angarsk between 1992 and 2000. But this was only the beginning of the story. The police had made many mistakes during their investigation. Some evidence collected from crime scenes had been incorrectly analyzed for years, while other evidence had never been examined at all. Because the murders had continued for so many years, no one initially realized they might be connected. But the biggest mistake was that no one had ever considered Popkov as a suspect, because he was a police officer who had served in Angarsk, a police officer, but also one of the most terrifying serial killers in Russian history, DNA testing and 3,500 police officers. By 2012, Russian police had begun re-examining female murder cases that had remained unsolved for years. Technology had changed, DNA analysis had advanced. Connections that couldn't be found in the past were now detectable. Authorities decided to investigate all police officers who had served during the years the murders were committed, as well as other relevant individuals in the area at that time. Because one thing was clear: the killer had gone undetected for years, and this could only have been possible if he was someone on the inside. When authorities reanalyzed evidence collected in the past, they discovered that the same DNA sample kept appearing in the victims' fingernail scrapings and on their bodies. However, this DNA wasn't registered in any database, because at that time in Russia, there was no requirement for police officers' DNA to be entered into databases. That's when a historic decision was made. 3,500 police officers were called in for DNA testing. Additionally, the same vehicle tracks kept appearing at crime scenes: a Lada 4x4, an off-road vehicle used by police. Tire tracks had been found near many of the bodies. And there was one more detail: Popkov had contracted the same sexually transmitted disease as one of his victims. The DNA sample taken from Popkov's daughter matched the DNA found at crime scenes with a high degree of probability. Now the target was clear: childhood and youth Mikhail Viktorovich. Popkov was born on March 7, 1964, during the Soviet Union era in Norilsk, Krasnoyarsk Krai, Russia. His family soon moved to Angarsk in the Irkutsk Oblast. a small industrial city known for Siberia's harsh climate. Angarsk was particularly known during the Soviet period for its oil refineries and heavy industry facilities. The Popkov family belonged to the working class. His father worked in a factory and his mother worked in a kindergarten. The environment he grew up in had a typical Soviet town atmosphere: discipline, order, and strict rules. However, there were hints that his family wasn't as happy as it appeared. In later years, some psychologists suggested that traumas experienced in his family and feelings of insecurity were influential motivations for Popkov's crimes. Some reports claim his mother had alcohol problems and raised him with abuse. One of the most notable incidents was that he had witnessed his mother's extramarital affairs. It's believed that learning his mother was with another man may have triggered his hatred toward women. However, this wasn't directly confirmed information. Throughout his childhood, he had an introverted and quiet personality. During his school years, he showed no criminal tendencies. His teachers and classmates described him as an average student. He was never the best or worst student in his class. To most people, he was unremarkable and unnoticeable. During high school, he didn't display any special talents or academic achievements. After high school, he joined the Soviet Army to complete his military service. Military and police service. The military was a turning point for many young men. They were raised under conditions of discipline, obedience, and harsh physical demands. After joining the army, Popkov was described as a soldier who adapted well to the rules. After completing his military service, he decided to become a police officer. Behind this decision was both a desire to represent state power and an urge to gain respect in his community. Becoming a police officer was still an important profession in the Soviet Union and economically promised a better future than other jobs. He enrolled in police academy. There he underwent physical and theoretical training. But even at the academy, he didn't exhibit any unusual behavior. According to his instructors, he was a disciplined, hardworking, and compliant student. The only thing that set him apart was that he was excessively quiet. In 1986, after graduating from the police academy, he began working at the Angarsk police department. The unit he was assigned to was a patrol team dealing with theft and petty crimes. Initially, he went on street patrols, then participated in interrogation procedures. People described him as a problem-free officer. He didn't have an aggressive or authoritarian attitude. However, during this period, his particularly harsh attitude toward female offenders or women out late at night began to draw attention. Among his colleagues, he made harsh comments about women's morality. But this wasn't questioned much at the time. Family life and double life, Mikhail Popkov married at a young age. His wife Elena was a teacher at a school in Angarsk. From the outside, their relationship seemed quite normal. The couple had a daughter named Ekaterina. Popkov led the life of a typical middle-class Soviet family with his family. His wife and close circle described him as a good father and faithful husband. He was a hard-working man who spent time with his family after work and helped with household chores. He enjoyed spending time with his children. He displayed a polite and considerate attitude toward his wife. But in later years, some details emerged. His wife noticed some of his obsessive behaviors. His excessive sensitivity about cleanliness and hygiene and his constant washing of his car's interior were particularly striking. But at the time, no one knew what was hidden behind these habits. The double lives of serial killers. Most serial killers are known in society as completely normal, even respected individuals. This contradictory situation has attracted the attention of psychology and criminology experts, and various explanations have been developed. Serial killers generally lead double lives. During the day, they're respected members of society. At night, they can be savage killers. This helps them hide their true intentions and actions. For example, Ted Bundy was known as a handsome and charismatic young man. As a law student, he had a respected position and was loved by those around him. But behind this outward appearance lurked a cold-blooded killer. Many serial killers exhibit signs of psychopathy. Psychopaths are characterized by lack of empathy, superficial charm, and manipulative behavior. These traits allow them to be perceived as normal, even attractive individuals in society. Andrei Chikatilo was known in the Soviet Union as a respected teacher and family man, but he had secretly murdered 52 people. Mikhail Popkov, in a similar way, was known from the outside as a respected police officer, a loving husband and father. But behind this normal appearance lurked one of Russia's most ruthless serial killers. Serial killer motivations. The motivations underlying why killers commit murder are generally examined in these categories. Desire for power and control. Such killers act with the desire to establish absolute dominance over their victims. Murder is a way for them to demonstrate their power and control abilities. Missionary. Some serial killers believe they are cleansing society by eliminating a specific group of people, for example, sex workers or certain ethnic groups. This is a type of mission and duty in their eyes. Pleasure-oriented murders. This category includes killers who derive sexual or emotional pleasure from murder. Visionary or delusional killers. These killers commit murder due to hallucinations or delusions. Sadistic motivations. Some serial killers enjoy torturing their victims and making them suffer. This satisfies their sadistic urges. Popkov's murder motivations align with these categories. Additionally, the violence and torture he inflicted on his victims demonstrate his sadistic tendencies. In Popkov's own words, "I don't know why I did this. If you want to look for a reason, maybe you can accept that I was born a hunter." The first murder. 1992. On a winter day in 1992, a woman's body was found in a forested area near Angarsk. The body was partially covered with snow. The person who found the body was a villager walking in the forest. At first, he thought it was an animal attack. But when he approached the body, it became clear the situation was much more horrific. Her clothes were torn, her body brutally mutilated. Her head and body had been attacked repeatedly with cutting and piercing instruments. But the most terrifying thing was the evidence that she had been seriously tortured before death. When police arrived at the scene, they initially couldn't distinguish this murder from others. At that time, crime rates were very high in Russia. Murders were happening every day in Angarsk and the surrounding area. So no one thought this could be the beginning of a serial killer's spree. However, autopsy results showed the victim had been sexually assaulted before being killed. More horrifyingly, she had been sexually assaulted even after death, necrophilia. It was also understood that the attack was extremely violent, committed more in a fit of rage than as an ordinary murder. The woman's identity was quickly established. She was a 19-year-old young woman. Her friends said they last saw her getting into a police car. But no one paid much attention to this, because at that time, trust in police was complete. No one thought a colleague could be behind the murders. This was Mikhail Popkov's first known murder. At that time, no one even considered him a suspect for this crime. And that's exactly why he was able to continue killing. The first mistakes of Russian police, at that time, Russia was in great turmoil after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Due to economic crisis, rising crime rates and inadequate security forces, murders were routine for the police. Police didn't pay much attention to the details of the murder. They evaluated it as a sudden murder committed by someone under the influence of alcohol or drugs. However, the extreme violence in this murder indicated that the perpetrator had a psychologically different profile. Among the evidence collected at the scene were footprints in the area and some fiber fragments. But at that time, DNA testing wasn't common in Russia. Also, many pieces of evidence weren't properly stored. This murder remained unsolved due to police's wrong evaluations, negligence, and inadequate investigation methods. And this mistake emboldened Popkov. He realized this murder would never be solved. He knew the police weren't after him, and he didn't need to look for a reason to kill a second time. In Popkov's own words, "I remember the first woman I killed. I was shaking before killing her. But then this feeling passed, replaced by a sense of relief. At that moment, I realized that if you do it once, you can do it again." 1994. The hunt begins 1994. A cold winter night. The streets of Angarsk were silent. That night, Popkov was driving his patrol car. He was on duty as a police officer, but at the same time, he was hunting. After a while, he saw a woman walking alone. She was slightly drunk and clearly looking for a way to get home. Popkov pulled his car up beside the woman, rolled down the window, and spoke in a gentle tone. "What are you doing out at this hour? Let me give you a ride home. It could be dangerous." The woman hesitated for a moment, but when she realized the person in front of her was a police officer, she felt relieved. He was trustworthy, a police officer. She got in the car. Popkov started the engine and headed out of the city. But the woman realized the road wasn't going home. "We're not going this way." Popkov remained silent. The road was narrowing. The city lights were left behind. The surroundings were now only darkness and trees. It was too late. Popkov drove the car into the forest and turned off the engine. That night, another woman went missing in Angarsk. The woman's body was found 2 days later by a group of woodcutters. All the details were the same as the first murder: extreme violence, stab wounds, signs of beating, sexual assault before death. And again, her body had been sexually assaulted after death, but police recorded this case as an independent incident as well. The killing cycle of serial killers, according to criminology experts, serial killers become addicted to the act of killing in 4 basic stages. The first murder is a test. If they aren't caught, they can repeat it. In the second and third murders, fear decreases and confidence increases. After the fourth murder, killing becomes a necessity. Most killers cannot stop killing. Popkov's process developed exactly this way. After the first murder, he wasn't caught. In fact, no one even had the slightest suspicion about him. This made him even more reckless. Over time, killing became a need for him. The biggest advantage of a police officer, Popkov's biggest advantage, was being a police officer. He usually got his victims into his car of their own free will. A woman might hesitate to get into a stranger's car late at night, but a police car? This was his greatest advantage. They trusted him. Additionally, Popkov knew how evidence was collected and analyzed. That's why he took more care not to leave evidence and to hide his tracks, because he knew the negligence and shortcomings within the police. He took advantage of these weak points. He also knew very well which areas were more secluded, where there were no security cameras, which roads were less traveled. He even took murder weapons from the police evidence room. He would take knives, hammers, and ropes that had been used in other crimes, use them on his victims, then clean them of fingerprints and discard them. That's why he always took his victims to places that wouldn't attract police attention. 2000. Years of terror in 1995. On a cold night, Popkov was on patrol again. Inside his car, he slowly moved forward, scanning the roads. That night, another familiar scenario played out. On a street near the city centre, a drunk woman was walking alone. Her steps unsteady, she had removed her gloves and left her coat zipper open. Her face was red from the cold. But apparently, with the warmth provided by alcohol, she didn't care. Popkov slowed his car, opened the window, and said in a gentle tone that he could give her a ride home. "It's very cold. Walking alone isn't a good idea." The woman squinted. There was a police officer in front of her. She was drunk. Walking was difficult. Moreover, getting into a police car meant she would be safe. Without hesitation, she opened the door and sat inside. The moment she got in the car, everything was clear to Popkov. For him, this was just a game. The victim always got in the car trustingly, soon became frightened, struggled, but each time ended the same way. After a while, the woman realized this wasn't the right road. "Hey, my house isn't this way. Where are you going?" Popkov was silent. His eyes were locked on the road ahead. The woman began to feel uncomfortable. She checked the door with her eyes, looking for a chance to get out. But the car had already sped up. "Please stop. Please stop," she screamed. The woman tried to open the door, but it was locked. She was banging her hands on the door. The effect of the alcohol had now worn off, replaced by fear. Popkov turned to the woman for the first time and said, "It's no use struggling." That night, another woman was killed, left in the forest, under the snow. The discovery of the third body and first suspicions days. Later, a man noticed something. Under the snow, there was a woman's body, almost completely covered. He immediately called the police. When the team arrived at the scene, they immediately understood the cause of the woman's death. Stab wounds, signs of beating, and signs of strangulation. But unlike the previous two murders, there was an interesting detail about the woman's body. Her clothes had been removed in an orderly manner, her body positioned in a strange way. One of the detectives investigating crimes committed in the region at that time noticed some similarities for the first time. This was the third female body found in recent years. They had all been killed in similar ways, but still, no one saw these as the work of a serial killer. And once again, Popkov continued his life without arousing suspicion. Now, killing had become ordinary for him. A need, an obsession, a ritual. And after this murder, he would start killing much more frequently. Victim profile and mission. Mikhail Popkov's victims were generally lone women who were out late at night. He thought they had put themselves in danger through their own mistakes, specifically targeting those who had been drinking. In his mind, he had labeled these women as immoral. He believed he was cleansing society by killing them. Sex workers, those living alone, or women away from their families were the most suitable targets for him. Their deaths wouldn't attract much attention, their disappearances wouldn't be thoroughly investigated. Even his wife had noticed something was wrong. He meticulously cleaned his car constantly. Even though his wife found this strange, she dismissed this obsession. However, according to psychologists, the extreme violence Popkov inflicted wasn't just a desire to murder. He harbored great anger toward the women he killed. It's known that most killers who commit such violent crimes have great hatred or trauma in their past. In Popkov's case, the root of this hatred went back to childhood. According to allegations, his mother had alcohol problems and raised him with abuse. Additionally, he had witnessed his mother's extramarital affairs, and this event caused him to develop mistrust and hatred toward women. Years later, while working in the police force, he was known to make statements demeaning women who drank alcohol and were prostitutes, disparaging them. He believed he was punishing them by killing them. He saw himself as a kind of moral guardian. This mindset recalls one of the Soviet Union's most terrifying serial killers, Nikolai Jumagaliev. Jumagaliev also saw himself as a cleaner, purifying society from sins. However, unlike Popkov, he wasn't eating the women he killed, but he sexually assaulted their bodies after death, necrophilia. Both described themselves as moral guardians who believed they were maintaining order by killing women. Mentier, 2006. Peak. Years Popkov's killing urge reached its peak between 1998 and 2006. During these years, the frequency of his murders increased, the crimes he committed became more brutal, and his methods became increasingly sadistic. According to official records available to us, he killed 22 women between 1998 and 2000, but these were only known cases. Considering Popkov's confessions and unsolved murders in the region, this number is estimated to be much higher. T9, one of the most horrific murders. By the early 2000s, Popkov's killing methods had become clear. Some of the murders he committed during this period stood out from others in terms of brutality. In the winter months of 1999, the body of a 20-year-old young woman was found in a village near Angarsk. There were more than 40 stab wounds on her body, but the most terrifying detail was that certain parts of her body had been deliberately deformed and her hands had been severed. This murder chilled the police. Death wasn't just a goal, but also involved torture. Popkov didn't kill the victim instantly. She had been injured first, stayed alive for hours, then was killed. 2001 pregnant woman. Murder, one of Popkov's most horrific murders, was committed in 2001. That night, a woman got into Popkov's car. She said she was pregnant and wanted to go home. But this triggered a different urge in Popkov's sadistic mind. That night, the woman's body was found in an industrial area. She had been hit repeatedly with hard objects, her throat was cut, and her abdomen was slashed. When Popkov later recounted this murder, he would say, "I didn't want to allow her to become a mother." 2003, police begin to suspect 2003 was the year when Popkov's killing frequency reached the level of almost one murder per month. But he worked so systematically and carefully that he still wasn't even a suspect in any investigation. Police began to suspect after 5 female bodies killed by similar methods were found in the same area during 2003, but they didn't have a clear perpetrator profile. 2006, the final year of brutality. 2006 was perhaps Popkov's most brutal year. He killed 5 women in just a few months. One of these cases was particularly striking. A young woman had been raped before being killed, then subjected to attack with cutting instruments. But the most horrifying detail was that Popkov had left a razor blade next to the body. This detail showed that he now felt invincible and was sending mocking messages to the police. 1998, 2011, retirement and interim. Period. Popkov, who had been actively killing until 2006, suddenly stopped. This didn't fit serial killer profiles. Most killers continue until they're caught or killed.
So why had he stopped?
Because in 1998, Popkov resigned from the police force. He later worked as a security guard at the Angarsk oil and chemical company and at a private firm. After a while, he moved out of the city with his family. Leaving the police meant disruption of his killing routine. He could no longer patrol as he wished. He didn't have access to a police car. Serial killers generally either have died, been caught, or become physically unable to commit murder when they stop. In Popkov's case, even though there was no physical obstacle, not committing murder for years was striking. However, after 2010, he killed at least 3 more women. His last known murder was in 2011, and at this point, he didn't realize that the luck that had protected him for years would no longer help him. 12. The capture. By 2012, Russian police had begun re-examining female murder cases that had remained unsolved for years. Technology had changed, DNA analysis had advanced. Connections that couldn't be found in the past were now detectable, but the biggest problem was still that no suspect had been found for these murders. At this point, authorities decided to investigate all police officers who had served during the years the murders were committed, and other relevant people in the area at that time. Because one thing was clear: the killer had gone undetected for years, and this could only have been possible if he was someone on the inside. DNA testing and 300 to 500 police officers. When authorities reanalyzed evidence collected in the past, they noticed that the same DNA sample kept appearing in victims' fingernail scrapings and on their bodies. However, this DNA wasn't registered in any database because at that time in Russia, there was no requirement for police officers' DNA to be entered into databases. That's why DNA samples taken from bodies didn't match anything in databases. The teams conducting the investigation faced legal obstacles in directly obtaining DNA from former police officers. According to Russian law, there had to be direct suspicion of a crime to obtain a DNA sample from someone. But pursuing such a procedure for retired people like Popkov could create legal problems, so researchers decided to follow a more indirect method. They tried to identify the perpetrator by obtaining DNA samples from relatives of former police officers, especially their children. That's when a historic operation was launched, 3500. Police officers were called in for DNA testing. The DNA sample taken from Popkov's daughter matched the DNA found at crime scenes, with a high degree of probability. Also, the same vehicle tracks kept appearing at crime scenes: a Lada Forks 4, an off-road vehicle used by police. Tire tracks had been found near many bodies. And one more detail: Popkov had contracted the same sexually transmitted disease as one of his victims. Now the target was clear. Police determined that Popkov hadn't been living in Angarsk for a while, that he was now working as a car salesman in Vladivostok. But this meant he couldn't escape, because now the target was clear. Surveillance and arrest police began secretly monitoring Popkov. Phone records, bank movements, travel routes were examined. Physical surveillance began, but Popkov looked like an ordinary man, as always. He wasn't making any suspicious moves, nor was he acting like he was going to escape. In December 2012, information was received that Popkov would be traveling by train from Vladivostok to Moscow. This was the perfect moment to catch him, because he would be in an enclosed space with no chance of escape. Russian security forces positioned themselves at the station, but the operation was kept completely secret, because Popkov had been in the police
Force for years, and there might still be people
sympathetic to him who could protect him. All of Russia would learn that the monster they had been hunting for years had finally been caught. And this was the moment when the years, known as the Werewolf and the Wednesday murderer, came to an end for Popkov. Public shock and media. The
news of Mikhail Popkov's
arrest had a bombshell effect in Russia in 2012. The fact that a former police officer was behind dozens of brutal murders that had remained unsolved for years deeply shook the public's sense of trust. Initial reports were built on the possibility that the person caught could be the Angarsk
monster. At the beginning of 2013,
Russian news agencies and television channels detailed the murders Popkov had committed for years. They claimed that the murders he committed could even surpass Chikatilo. Rossiya 24, REN TV, NTV, and other major media organizations scrutinized Popkov's life and the murders he committed. Some newspapers wrote that due to Russia's chain of systematic errors, it took years to catch such killers. In street interviews, talk shows, and on social media, the issue that angered people the most was that he was able to comfortably continue his serial murders during his years as a police
officer, and whether he was under a kind of state
protection. Authorities faced a major wave of distrust toward the Russian justice system and police force, especially on social media platforms. Some people thought Popkov wasn't acting alone and might have received support from within. Since most of the murders were committed in the 90s and 2000s, many victims' families had been waiting for justice for years but received no response. Many victims' families claimed that police didn't even show them death reports. Some of their statements were as follows: "My daughter was killed in 1998. We still don't know how she really died.
When I heard he was a police officer, I wasn't shocked.
There must have been a killer among the police who couldn't catch a killer for years. For us, Popkov's capture isn't a victory, it's a shame.
Because he was allowed to walk freely for
20 years. The detail that he was a police officer further reinforced the feeling among the public that you can't trust anyone. Interrogation, process, and confessions. After being caught, Mikhail Popkov was taken directly to Moscow, to the Federal Investigation Bureau. Initially, he was cold-blooded. There was no fear or panic in his eyes. It was even recorded that at some moments he smiled slightly at the police. "What do you want me to tell you? Do you want me to confess?" Then asked me which one should I start with. Interrogators began laying out the evidence they had one by one. DNA under victims' nails, torture marks on found bodies, Popkov's duty stations on dates when murders were committed. Popkov nodded and fixed his eyes on the documents on the interrogation table. Then he made a confession. "Only DNA caught me.
Otherwise,
I could have continued for another 20 years. This statement froze everyone's blood in the room. Development of confessions. Popkov initially admitted to a few murders, but didn't claim all of them. Police pressed him. The number of confessions increased. In his first confession, he said, "I lived like everyone else.
I became a police officer, got married, had a child.
But there was something else inside me.
I wanted to kill."
This was a duty for me. That's how I felt. When officers asked him why he killed, Popkov's answer was clear. "I found women immoral. Those who drink, those who wander outside late at night, they were corrupt. Someone had to stop them." When police reminded him that victims died in pain and were brutally murdered, Popkov said with a completely emotionless expression, "I just helped them.
I saved them from that life." At this point, one of the police officers raised his voice. "Who do you think you are? God?" Popkov smiled. "I could have made them suffer forever."
But I just ended them. One of the most horrific moments, one of the most horrifying details that caught police attention during the interrogation process was Popkov's manner of speaking. As if talking about someone else's crimes, he narrated in a cold and distant language. During interrogation, Popkov was trying to determine exactly how many murders he had committed. Initially, he confessed to 5 murders, then it became 10. Within a week, he admitted to 22, but police thought he was still hiding some. In the following days of interrogation, Popkov did something completely unexpected. When police asked him why he was so brutal, why he stabbed his victims repeatedly, Popkov suddenly laughed. When officers asked him what was wrong, Popkov said in a muffled voice, "You know, I didn't plan this much at first. But after I started killing, I realized something. The human body is very resilient. It lasts longer than I thought." At this point, one of the detectives in the interrogation room angrily left, because this sentence clearly showed that Popkov enjoyed not the killing itself, but the process. This incident went on record as one of the most psychologically challenging moments for police during Popkov's interrogation process. Final. Numbers as interrogations progressed. Popkov confessed to more murders. But he didn't do this with any remorse. On the contrary, he seemed relaxed, as if the time to tell had finally come. After all the evidence and confessions were gathered, it was confirmed that Popkov had killed at least 78 women, but he himself implied there could be more that he didn't remember. Toward the end of the interrogations, one of the detectives asked him a final direct question. "Do you feel any remorse?" Popkov shook his head from side to side and gave this answer. "It doesn't mean anything. Even if I'm sorry, nothing changes." And at that moment, the interrogations were completed. Now the courtroom awaited him. Trial process. 2015. In early 2015, the Mikhail Popkov case officially began. He was being tried for murders committed in Angarsk and Irkutsk, but this wouldn't be an ordinary trial. It would go down in history as the trial of Russia's bloodiest serial killer. The courtroom was surrounded by security measures. Attending the trial were families of women who were victims of his murders, Russian press, and detectives who had taken special interest. Everyone's eyes were on Popkov, once known in the city as an honest police officer. But he entered the courtroom as if nothing had happened, his handcuffed hands behind him, his head up. He was neither afraid nor ashamed, just silent. As the prosecutor read Popkov's murders one by one, a deathly silence reigned in the courtroom.
One name was read, then another, then another.
The list of murdered women lasted more than 20 minutes. In the hall, the sobs of victims' relatives began to be heard. Some were crying quietly, while others watched the trial with clenched fists. But there wasn't a single sign of emotion on Popkov's face. When the prosecutor finished the indictment, there was a brief silence in the courtroom. Then the judge addressed the defendant. "Do you have anything to say?" Popkov raised his head. His voice echoed off the cold walls of the courtroom. "I did them all." Uproar rose in the hall.
Victims' relatives screamed, "Monster! Look at the faces of the people you killed. How can you speak so calmly?"
"You'll burn in hell!" The judge struck his gavel hard to suppress the shouts. But even at that moment, Popkov's face was expressionless. Defense and mission statement. When the defense's turn came, Popkov followed a rather strange method. He wasn't denying himself, but he was describing his actions as a cleansing mission. These women were corrupt. We all know this.
"I just stopped them."
"I made a kind of correction." These words once again plunged the courtroom into anger and chaos. One of the victims' relatives jumped up and shouted through tears, "Who are you to punish them?"
"They were alive, but you're a scumbag."
The verdict. Throughout the hearings, victims' relatives listened to the accusations against Popkov and expressed their reactions. Some families said they were filled with a sense of revenge for this moment they had been waiting for years, while others were too devastated to even accept him speaking in court. One victim's mother stood up with trembling hands. "My daughter saw you as a police officer. She trusted you. She got in your car without fear. But now, there's her blood on your hands." As the trials progressed, the judge's attitude also began to harden. The court had concluded that this man was not only a serial killer, but also a severe psychopath. One day, the judge asked Popkov a direct question. "Why don't you show any remorse at every opportunity we give you? Don't you intend to apologize to people?" With his usual calm, Popkov gave this answer. "They won't forgive me."
"So why should I apologize?"
At this point, the judge's patience ran out. "Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, due to the crimes you committed, the indifference you've shown, and the terror you've created for society, you will be tried with the heaviest penalty under the laws of the Russian Federation. Whether you're sorry or not doesn't matter anymore." At the end of 2015, the court's verdict was announced. Mikhail Popkov was sentenced to life imprisonment under Article 105 of the Russian Federation Criminal Code for serial murder and crimes committed with extreme brutality. When the verdict was announced in the courtroom, some of the victims' relatives burst into tears, while others stood up and applauded. Popkov once again showed no reaction, and the guards escorted him out of the hall. Second trial, 2018, Mikhail Popkov, who was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2015, confessed to 59 more murders while in prison. In 2018, a second case was opened. A new trial began to prosecute the 59 murders Popkov had confessed to after his initial conviction. On December 10, 2018, at a hearing held in the Irkutsk Regional Court, Popkov was found guilty of 56 additional murders. 3 murders could not be proven due to lack of evidence. Popkov received a second life sentence. With this verdict, Popkov's official conviction count reached 70 murders. The prosecutor stated in court that Popkov had a pathological attraction to killing people and homicidal mania with sadistic elements, but that he was sane enough to stand trial. The court also revoked Popkov's police pension 2021 and 2023. Additional convictions. July 2021, Popkov was tried for 2 more murders he committed in 1995 and received an additional 9 years. An 8-month sentence. November 2023, Popkov was tried for 3 more female murders he committed in 1997, 1998 and 2003 and received an additional 10 years sentence. April 2025, Popkov confessed to killing a school cleaner with a tourist axe in 2011. The real victim, Count Popkov's official conviction count was recorded as 87 murders. However, he himself confessed to having committed up to 90 murders. Police sources claim the real number could be close to 200. Popkov has gone down in history as Russia's bloodiest serial killer. He has long surpassed the victim counts of Andrei Chikatilo, 52 murders, and Alexander Pichushkin, 48 murders. Prison life Mikhail Popkov, sentenced to life imprisonment in 2015, was initially announced to be sent to Black Dolphin, Kara Yunus, one of Russia's most heavily secured prisons. However, in January 2024, he was transferred to a special regime colony in Mordovia. This is where Russia's most dangerous criminals are held: serial killers, cannibals, terrorists, and those who have committed crimes against children. Daily life Popkov is being held in a 4-person cell. His daily life has turned into an ordinary, even boring routine. He wakes up at 6 a.m., does cell cleaning, 15 minutes of mandatory morning exercise. Most of his day is spent working in the prison sewing workshop. He says about this: "I sew 100 trouser pockets a day, but someone else attaches them to the trousers. We work like assembly line production." No remorse. In an interview with a journalist in 2022, he talks about his life in prison and his confrontation with the past. But whether this confrontation is real remorse or a serial killer's attempt to put himself on justifying ground is unclear. Popkov doesn't avoid talking about murders, but there's no emotional depth in these conversations. As if recounting murders committed by someone else, he speaks in ordinary language. I don't want to remember those days. Thinking about these things doesn't tire me anymore. It doesn't make sense. A hypnosis expert interrogated me, made me remember some things. But it's in the past. I don't think about it anymore. I've thought about it 1,000 times, but what's done is done. This answer perfectly summarizes Popkov's psychological structure. A serial killer's failure to deeply feel the consequences of his crimes, even rationalizing them. Relationships with family. Popkov's police rank was taken away. His pension was also cut. He still talks to his daughter occasionally by phone, but he seems to have put up a wall between himself and his family. I don't want to bother them unnecessarily. It's hard enough for them. Death penalty and ironic thoughts. At one point, Popkov is asked about his thoughts on the death penalty. His answer is quite ironic. "If the death penalty comes back, I'll be the first person executed." But then he makes a striking confession: how Popkov expresses wishing his life had given him a different direction. "I wish they'd sold me to the gypsies as a child." This statement is important for understanding criminal psychology. Does he really want a different life, or is he just trying to portray himself as a victim? Some days he writes something in his notebook, but he doesn't tell anyone what he writes. Sometimes he just stares at the wall in his cell. A psychologist evaluated his mental state as follows: he's living in a world where he can no longer kill, but inside his head, he's still killing. The Ukraine Front Request, 2023. In January 2023, shocking news came from Russia. Mikhail Popkov announced he wanted to volunteer to fight on the Ukraine front. During the Ukraine invasion, Russia developed a system to send inmates from prisons to the front. If an inmate survives 6 months, it's promised they'll be pardoned and released. Russian state television Vesti conducted an interview with Popkov. When asked, "What do you dream of?" Popkov gave this answer: joining the army. Popkov said he knew fighting in Ukraine wasn't a computer game or fiction books, but he added, realistically, how would I manage to get through January and February? For me, the coldest frosts are the worst, but I wouldn't hesitate. Considering my military specialization, I think it's quite in demand now, he said. However, he admitted he would need to learn new skills, even though I've been in prison for 10 years. I don't think it would be so hard to learn new skills. Popkov didn't specify what his military experience was. Reports say he has only worked as a police officer and security guard. This request is still waiting for an answer. However, considering his additional convictions in 2023 and 2024, the likelihood of being sent to Ukraine seems slim. Remorse and conscience, Dostoevsky says in Crime and Punishment. The person who commits a crime receives the greatest punishment not from the court, but from their own conscience. But in Mikhail Popkov's story, this statement loses validity because there's no conscience inside him. That's why neither the screams in the courtroom, nor the memories of victims, nor the punishment he received meant anything to him. He just fell silent. The hunter who once spread fear, the man he chose with his own hands, is now condemned to rot within four walls. But if there's no sense of justice inside a person, no external punishment can affect them. And if a person has no conscience, no punishment is real punishment for them. That's why perhaps Mikhail Popkov's greatest punishment isn't having to spend the rest of his life this way, but something completely different. He can never kill again. Conclusion, Mikhail Viktorovich. Popkov has gone down in history as Russia's bloodiest serial killer. Official conviction, 87 murders. Total confessed, 90 plus. Estimated real number, up to 200. Popkov's story isn't just the story of a monster. It's also the story of how a system failed, how trust was abused, how an insider could commit murders undetected for 20 years, how justice was delayed, and most importantly, how a person without conscience could hide in society. The Werewolf, the Angarsk Maniac, the Wednesday Murderer. Mikhail Popkov is now only remembered by these nicknames, and he's still in his cell in Mordovia, sewing 100 trouser pockets a day.